It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Kyle Greenwood, and we're going to be discussing his new book, The Dictionary of English Grammar for Students of Biblical Languages. Kyle, it's a great honor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shaun. Nice to meet you.
Well, you're brand new to me. I'm brand new to you, but we're not here to talk about me. So let's kick off our conversation with a bit of what we might call the Kyle Greenwood origin story. So for those of us who are encountering you for the first time in this talk today, what are a few things we should know about you?
Well, what you should know and what that may be
only the good stuff.
So I grew up in a small town in Southern Ohio called Ironton, Ohio, and met my wife, Karen, at the University of Cincinnati, where we were both undergrads. We've been married for coming up on 27 years later this summer. Got 3 kids, almost empty nesters, as the youngest one is finishing up high school next year. Guess more to the origin story, and it ties into the book, is the book is dedicated to my parents, and they celebrated their 60th anniversary this past March. So kind of fitting tribute to them.
Well, 60 years, that is quite an accomplishment. My wife and I are in range of the 23-year mark. So yes, apparently getting to even 10 or 20 years is an accomplishment these days. 60 years, that's stupendous.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, let's dig a little bit more into your origin story before we get to the book. With academic authors, I'm always curious to hear about, what was your education background? And was there any particular area of focus or specialization for you in your studies?
Yeah, so I got my MDiv from the Asbury Theological Seminary, PhD from Hebrew Union College in Hebraic and Cognate Studies. Interesting question about my specialties, areas of specialization. Since I taught undergrads, I really kind of chased whatever questions the students were raising. So I've spent a lot of time and delved in a lot of different areas. Let's put it that way. A little bit of a academic mutt in terms of my publication record. I'm all over the map. But my first 2 books were really tied in with kind of Genesis and creation type of stuff. So that's probably been one of the major focuses of my research.
And I'm always curious to hear when people first encountered the study of biblical languages. Like for me, it was first year of undergrad as a freshman. That's when I started cutting my teeth on languages. For you, was that college? Was that seminary? When did that come into your life?
I'm not sure when it first kind of crossed my radar, but the first time that I encountered a class was I took a crash course my summer after undergraduate, and it was we didn't learn paradigms. It was very much using an interlinear to kind of track, and basically how to use the tools of Greek. And it wasn't for another 3 years until I got into seminary where I kind of really jumped in headlong with the biblical languages. And as look at my course record, I think I took about 25% or 30% of my courses were in some sort of language or exegetical coursework. So that's kind of where I fell headlong into the study of language. And if I recall, I wasn't really much of an academic in undergraduate. I mean, I got by. I changed majors a number of times. I didn't know what I was up to. But when I took that Greek course after undergraduate, that was really kind of the first time that I really enjoyed the topic that I was studying. Not that there were courses that I liked and were interesting to me, but that one really got the juices flowing.
Well, I think for people who are listening or viewing this, and they're like, wow, why would we be excited about a dictionary? Isn't that just some kind of a reference we have on the shelf and we only need occasionally? But one of the things I think people don't quite grasp is if they haven't gone through language studies themselves, or if they haven't spent years teaching students, a lot of times people don't quite grasp how students today are often very unprepared in terms of, their exposure to English grammar, what that practically means. I feel like there's things I did, like I took 4 years of German in high school, which was immensely helpful as I transitioned into learning Greek and Hebrew. But you don't really realize the things you don't know until you start trying to translate another language into English. And so, in terms of the need for a book like this, I'd like to start this next part of the conversation by having you just share, like, how ill prepared were some of the students that were coming in and learning languages from you? Because I feel like we don't, like I said, we don't realize what we don't know until we kind of cross that threshold and get into that first class.
Yeah, I think your tie-in with having German in high school is helpful, and students who have had some sort of foreign language study in high school certainly helps them as they move into biblical languages, because some of the they have to use terminology to talk about a language. So if an instructor is teaching biblical Hebrew or New Testament Greek, there's a certain language that is required to to communicate what is happening in the text, what is happening in the exercises or whatever, and we call these grammatical terms, right? We call these grammatical vocabulary, if you will. So, in a sense, the study of a biblical language requires another language, and that is the language of grammatical terminology, and that is not something that comes naturally for native speakers of English, right? I mean, we can speak English without having to know what a pronoun and a preposition and an article we don't need to know what those things are, because we know how the grammar functions. We don't have to call it things. But then when you start learning a different language, the instructor, to indicate what is happening in the sentence, what is happening syntactically, there has to be a set of terminology, a bank of vocabulary that they can use. And if students have never encountered that vocabulary, they're lost. And it's easy, and I could see this on the student's face, it's easy to get terminology confused. Adverb versus adjective. They're simple enough, but they start the same, and they kind of, if you're not entirely sure and haven't been using that language, as part of your vocabulary, as part of your language, then it can be somewhat of a stumbling block as students are encountering biblical languages, just dealing with the English aspect of things.
Well, next, let's get into kind of the look and the feel of the dictionary entries. One of the things that I think is brilliant in terms of how you laid this out is, in addition to explaining the term, you've got an English example, you've got a Greek example, you've got a Hebrew example. Would love to hear a little bit about what you're hoping to accomplish with the entries. I'm combining several of the questions I was going to ask you. Why you decided to have examples from all three of those languages, and then also why the NRSV was the best fit for the English translation you were going to use. So go.
When I first thought about this idea, another one of these things that came up just in the course of teaching, that's, this is a need. This is something that students are asking about. I can see the glaze over their eyes when I start talking about English grammatical terms. So maybe there should be a resource out there. And so I looked, and there were some things that were accomplished some of what I wanted to accomplish, but not exactly what I wanted to accomplish. And so when I first floated this idea, in my own mind and conjuring up the plan, I thought, well, it'd be helpful to have just a 25-page-ish book called A Dictionary of English Grammar for Students of Biblical Hebrew. Because that's what I taught. I taught Biblical Hebrew. But then it occurred to me a couple of things. One, I was hoping then that somebody else would come along and do one on Greek. And so there'd be sort of companion volumes on this. But I guess it occurred to me that there'd be a lot of duplication of effort there, and it would make sense just to combine both languages into one dictionary. It also occurred to me that definitions in and of themselves don't really help the student understand what the term is. It's just another list of abstract words that also need further clarification and defining. So I thought that the examples would put some substance around those definitions and help them understand exactly how this term is used in actual sentences. So I use examples in English, Hebrew, and Greek. I start out with English because I thought that would be what they would be most comfortable with, what they're most familiar with. If they can see how it functions in their native language, then they could transfer that more easily over into the biblical languages. So my apologies to lovers of Aramaic, but Aramaic did not get included as as examples just because a couple of reasons. One is there's a limited corpus of biblical Aramaic, and so it'd be hard to come up with examples for every entry. And the other thing, the book would just be much more bigger and costly if we did that. So, and the NRSV. Why did the NRSV? So, I toyed around with different options on there and what would work best. One idea would be to provide my own translation for each one, but that would be laborious, time-consuming, unnecessary, reinventing the wheel. There's good translations out there. So the advantage of something like a formal equivalent like the New American Standard is that you get all of the vocabulary there, and you get it in a good order that matches up nicely with the biblical text. But often it kind of it jumbles the understanding or the nuances of the grammatical function of words in the sentence. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum, something like a functional equivalent like the New Living Translation or the Common English Bible. You get some of the nuances of grammar, but then a lot of vocabulary, a lot of words are added to get there. So needed something in the middle. NRSV is one of those that fits kind of in the middle. I'm familiar with it. I'm comfortable with it. And I ran a number of test examples by a number of translations, and the NRSV just seemed to be one that worked best the most often in terms of trying to find that balance.
And in terms of, say, maybe audience for this book, but also vision for how this book could be used, I would love to have you comment on how this is going to be helpful for students who are actively in the classroom, but also for students who are maybe further into their master's or PhD studies, or for people like me who are I'm not even doing anything professionally that requires me to use biblical languages, but whether it's just a guy who learned Hebrew or Greek back in the day, or somebody who's a pastor, how is this going to benefit that audience as well?
Well, that's a broad.
I asked really broad questions.
we are casting the net wide on this thing, aren't we?
That's right.
So my original target audience when I was thinking of this, of course, were my own students, and they were undergraduates, first year students taking Hebrew 1 and 2, and for them it was just getting them familiar with and helping them recognize and make the connection between the language that they know with the biblical languages, helping them get a grasp on the terminology, the language of English grammar, if you will. So in that aspect, I saw it as a supplementary textbook for Hebrew 1, Hebrew 2, Greek 1, Greek 2, so that the instructor could spend less time in class defining terms and could say, find it in your dictionary. You can look that up, and if you have questions, let me know, and save time in class on some of that material, so they could spend more time, on paradigms and explaining syntax and function, that sort of thing in the classroom. So that's one area. Moving down, the more intermediate level students, I would see. One thing maybe to back up a little bit, the way that, I guess you already discussed this. There's examples for every single entry. So, and not just a phrase, but for the most part, entire verses. So, the intermediate student could use it, one, as a refresher of English grammar, because there's a lot of grammatical terms that you're not even going to encounter your first year of language study. You might, but maybe once or twice. But there's a lot of terminology that you won't even get to until you're in intermediate year of language study. But also it could be used just as an exercise book. There's so many examples that you could go through and as a refresher course, something to keep up on with your biblical languages. And I suppose that would also serve for somebody like yourself. He just wants to kind of go back and check on things with the added bonus of learning a little bit of grammatical terminology along the way.
Well, and, one feature that kind of surprised me was that you have a scripture index at the end of the book. So why did you decide to include that? And how are you hoping people put that to use?
Yeah, there's, I guess the simple answer is it's got a lot of scripture out. I have an index, but more functionally, what's the rationale for it? I was kind of thinking that the intermediate students might also be taking an exegesis course, and this would be a helpful tool for them to see if the passage that they're covering has some sort of comment on a verse that they're working with. I suppose that would also work for the curious reader who is just coming across something in a commentary, or they heard something that their pastor said or whatever and said, they could do a quick check to see if I have any comment on that. So that's kind of the main reasons for that.
Well, Kyle, it's almost time for us to wrap up. Anything we didn't cover in the interview that you want to make sure we work in about this dictionary?
I almost laughed when I received an invitation to do a podcast on a dictionary. And I'm excited that you're excited about the dictionary. I really think that it will serve and fill a gap for students who are trying to not just learn their biblical language, but will continue their biblical language. And hopefully it will make it a little less daunting of a task for them as they try to bridge that gap between the ancient world and the modern world of biblical of language.
And Kyle, for the listeners, the viewers who'd like to find out more, where should they go on the web?
Yeah, probably the best place to go would be zondervanacademic.com, and you can find my book by searching by my name or by the title.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can pick up your very own copy of this book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Kyle Greenwood. Once again, our book today was The Dictionary of English Grammar for Students of Biblical Languages. And if you'd like to find out more, a great place to start is the Zondervan Academic website. In addition to this dictionary, they've got tons of fantastic resources for studying biblical languages. You can check that out over at zondervanacademic.com. And Kyle, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you join us on the show.
Thanks a lot, Shaun. Appreciate it.